We will get any technical glitches that we have worked out. But today we have a really great panel. And this is Multifamily Cutting Edge Topics Part 1. We had so many issues in multifamily that we actually expanded it into 2 sessions. But before we get in there, I want to remind everybody that on Friday, we'll have the federal legislative update. Again, in that, there's so much activity federally and so much at the state level that we split those into 2 sessions. And Sherry Gully from Miami HFA will be the moderator of the panel, and we'll have the executive director and lead legislative person from NALHFA, along with the chair of the NALHFA legislative panel, will be on Friday. So if you're interested in federal, that's the next one this week. But today we're focusing on multifamily. The panelists that we have today are Ben Johnson, who's the president of Seltzer Management Company. They are a credit underwriter and compliance monitoring for many locals and for Florida Housing. Helen Feinberg, the managing director of RBC Capital Markets, who I'm sure you all know is our leading investment banker, and Monique Spots, a shareholder with Bryant Miller and Olive, bond counsel to many of the local HFA in the state. So what's happened in multifamily that made us focus on this as a start? And I think that the key to beginning is almost everyone is going to have more multifamily bond deals than you have historically. Now, there's many reasons or multiple reasons, but one of the most important was that the 4% housing credit rate, the tax credits that come with multifamily bonds, changed. And it used to be floating based upon an index of interest rates, and it had floated down so that the quote 4% credit was really worth less than 3.2%. And that was made a fixed 4% in one of the federal legislative packages. So that meant that it increased the equity, the free money going into bond deals massively. And therefore, a lot of deals that didn't work because they couldn't support enough debt to fill the gap between the equity and the cost, all of a sudden did work, or they worked with less gap financing, sale, or your local money. So there's just more deals coming. And what that made us look at is everybody's system really ready for that? And you know, how long has it been since you've looked at your policies and procedures? What issues have popped up, and what new structures are we seeing, and what kind of impact on policy does that have? I'd like to start by turning to Monique. And Monique, if you could talk about the as your work as bond counsel and how that impacted, you know, the review of the existing policies and you know, other thoughts you have on that.
Sure, thanks. And hello to everybody. I see all these familiar names and not a lot of faces, but hello, everyone. I want to back up just a second and just refresh everybody's memory. Most of the local HFAs in Florida were formed back in the mid 80s, early 90s. And they're formed by county ordinance or resolution. The county commission finding a need for a local HFA in their area. And I think many of our counties actually did that. And so the local HFAs operate under that ordinance or resolution, which gives them the powers under Chapter 159 in Florida statutes. Most of those resolutions and ordinances allowed the HFAs to also adopt guidelines and procedures. Sometimes they have to be approved by the county. Sometimes they're just at the discretion of the Housing Finance Authority to change them. So most of the authorities that I'm familiar with did adopt these policies and guidelines, but They were adopted a very long time ago when the programs were very, very different. And over the years, as things would pop up, they've just been added to and changed, and mostly added to. And with, as Mark mentioned, with the onslaught of new deals and new structures, as I think Helen's going to address, many new structures of multifamily financing, we were finding that the guidelines don't necessarily address anymore all of the issues that are coming up and have been coming up, or as they've been added to, they are addressing them, but inconsistently with some prior versions of the guidelines that haven't been addressed to catch up to the new things that have been added. So, with the assistance of several, Mark and several other people, we have been able to revamp some of our local HFA guidelines. And as we did that, we were very surprised to see that they were very outdated. And there are several reasons to have these guidelines and procedures, primarily to establish consistent requirements. And we have a really nice outline we've developed of what we think should be, a comprehensive list of what should be in the guidelines. And it includes both procedure for applicants, as well as content of required documents, required document provisions, professionals that are going to be required, and outside professionals, as well as review by the HFA. So I'd like to touch a little bit on those particular sort of the outline that we've come up with. And just to breeze through it, I won't belabor any one of them, but I want to give you an idea of what we think should be in your guidelines and what you should consider. We have an application process and the application fees. It's very important that the developers come to you knowing the expectation. And if they do, it makes the deal process a lot smoother. And once you have an established guideline and it's being applied consistently to all of your developers and all of your projects, it's much easier to consider a request for a waiver from one of your guidelines on a particular project that needs you to deviate from what you apply across the board. So that is also a purpose of the guidelines. It sets the standard. And once the standard, and on some deals, the standard doesn't work to achieve the goal, and they come to you for a waiver, but at least you have a benchmark. So
Monique, could I want you to keep going through each of those because they're important, but just a quick question.
sure.
One of the things that many HFAs have done is they've bifurcated their applications into kind of a full app and a mini app. And the mini app is so that for people that are also applying to Florida Housing for Sale. Is that something that you think needs to be addressed in the guidelines?
Yes, and I appreciate that, because I think that was something that has given, it's been very beneficial for both the developers streamlining their process with Florida Housing, as well as the HFA to be able to provide financing for these projects, because in a lot of circumstances, the developers don't have time to go through the application process, and they have to check the Florida Housing box automatically so that they can get through the process on time. The mini app is exactly what it sounds. It's a very short form version. We've established with some of the local HFAs different fees that are payable because they don't know if they're going to get the award. So the fees are just nominal to get the mini app in so that they can tell Florida Housing they have applied to the local HFA. Seems to have worked very well for a lot of local authorities, and is serving the purpose very well. So I hope that answered your question, but that is one thing that we have been implementing for many HFAs. So the fees, I think the application form should be available on the website. So the guidelines will provide the form of the application, where it is located, how it can be accessed, and when it's due, what fees are due when the application comes through, what fees are due for the professionals when the application comes in, what happens to those fees if the deal doesn't go forward. All of those things are addressed under the application process and application fees. The process is basically, what's the review of my application? The initial review, the credit underwriting process, if there are certain requirements where there's a special committee that has to assess the project, those things are all identified in the application process and fee category. Also, special requirements for special deals and special developments. This would include also like what the developers have to certify in order to become a developer that does business with you. And all of that would be submitted with the application package, as well as any sort of indemnities or fee agreements that they have to sign up front and submit with the application. So in addition to the guidelines, we're also recommending that HFAs take a really hard look at their application as well, and do this as a package, the guidelines and procedures, as well as the mini app and the full app, and make sure that they all tie together and you don't have different things required in the guidelines that aren't attached to the application. The next category of things in the guidelines are the transaction fees that developers should be, not the application fees, but the transaction fees that they should be expecting, and also the required transaction documents. So this would relate to whether there is a construction loan servicer and a construction loan servicing agreement and a fee that will be paid there, a compliance monitor and what the compliance monitoring fee is, and whether that's handled under a separate compliance monitoring agreement or whether it's handled by the HFA, and when that's payable, when all those fees are payable. Some issuers have a financial monitor and a financial monitoring agreement that goes through the life of the deal. And then some have a construction loan servicer that monitors the actual expenditure of the bond proceeds and sometimes the equity and subordinate loan funds, anything that's going to be used for the development that's in the development budget that's approved through the credit underwriting report. And so that is something else for a board to decide if the construction monitor will be engaged and what those fees will be. So and those loan document requirements would also include what guarantees this issuer is expecting with each deal. Standard guarantees that we see are a completion guarantee, guarantee of operating deficits, a guarantee of non-recourse obligations, and an environmental and fee guarantee. So that's another thing to consider, what guarantees. In the credit underwriting process, the credit underwriter will usually make recommendations as to what those guarantors will be, who those guarantors will be, individual or corporate guarantors. The next category is what your requirements are for the actual financing. Do you have an underwriter that you want involved in the deal, even if it's a private placement as a placement agent? Do you have a financial advisor that you want involved in the deal that you're going to require be involved from the beginning? What are your policies with respect to what we call big boy letters or investment letters? So if it's a private placement, what do you want the bond purchaser to sign, saying that they are an accredited investor or qualified institutional buyer? Those things, if they're laid out early, make the deal process much smoother. And those are policies of the HFA. That also includes minimum denominations. When you have a private placement and you want to make sure when it's transferred from one bond purchaser to another that they're not being transferred in $5,000 denominations. You want to make sure they're in high denominations so that you know they're going into the hands of other accredited investors and and institutional buyers. So those are kind of the basic things that you should consider in your policies, and making sure that they're consistent with your application process. And we also recommend that forms of everything be available. You know, the more expectations that you put to your applicants up front, again, the smoother the deal process goes. And there's just one more thing that is, and Helen, I think, is going to talk about these new deal structures that we're dealing with. They're very, very complicated. We have much more involvement from an issuer post closing and post issuance than we have seen in the past. And what this, by that I mean, a lot of the deals are going out in one mode for a construction phase, and then converting to a permanent phase. Sometimes they're going out in a short-term phase. So we've established fees that take into account different structures. We've established and you have to consider whether you want to establish fees for when the developers come back to you at conversion, for amendments to your documents, for subordination agreements if they pay off your bonds, for subordinate financing they might put on the project later on. We're seeing a lot of post-issuance requests. And one of the things that we've tried to outline in the procedures and guidelines we've done recently are, what is the process so that your professionals and your executive director and your chair, or they aren't getting emails from developers and developers council saying, hey, please approve this amendment. Here's some signature pages on a subordination agreement. Please sign these and send them back. There's a process. You write a letter, you state what your issue is, you state what the documentation is, and you make a request to the board for an actual formal action. That's been a really big problem with all these post-issuance things, where emails are just flying in, and then they usually tell you they need it in 2 days. So we have to slow everybody down. So those processes are really good. So people know, is there going to be a fee and what's the timing on this? So with that, I mean, if there are any questions, I mean, I could keep going on guidelines all day because I get on my soapbox, but.
Well, Monique, a couple of things. First, and we'll, I'll say this as the director of the HFA of Hillsborough County. I'm very proud of that entity. I think it's really a good one. And when I looked at the guidelines, they were, crap. Sorry, but we had, when I tried to go back to them and go, we need to kind of fix these up, we found that, and then we brought you and Misty and others into the process. And what we found was they couldn't be amended again. They'd been amended multiple times so that they were, sometimes, out of date, sometimes almost contradictory. They didn't match with the app. And yet, we'd kind of been on top of it to a degree. But what we found is that we had a document that just needed to be redrafted from scratch, as opposed to tinkered with. And I think that's, where others may find themselves in that process, and nothing wrong with that. You go back and it was actually, I think, less work in the end to just start over than it was to try to blackline a document that, was just wacky out of date. The other thing I would say, Monique, some of the things that change more often might best be in an application rather than in the guidelines. I mean, for example, if you add energy efficiency standards, well, your guideline may want to say that you're going to have them and that they'll be in the app. And then if you change them from time to time, you'd just be amending your application and not having to list all the guidelines in the, what is, I mean, is that fair to say that you'd want to tell people in the guidelines, you're going to find certain requirements in the application, but not repeat them in both? Is that
I think that's right. And I think that's why it's really important to update the application and the guidelines at the same time. So you know you're addressing everything in one place or the other, and it's going to be changeable much easier by changing the form of the app.
And one thing and I'm going to turn to Ben here in just a second, that one of the big picture things that's happening is not only are you getting more deals, but because there's more deals, allocation is going to and is becoming more scarce. And as allocation becomes more of a precious resource, we could very well be moving to a period of time where there's competition for that, as opposed to there's so much allocation, we don't know what to do with it, to, maybe you don't have enough. And that kind of puts the HFA more in a driver's seat with the developer than we have been, and with the ability to actually have guidelines. But Ben, if I could pose a question to you as a start. Oftentimes when we and you're muted still, Ben, so you probably want to get unmuted. The you We'll have people that'll get on that first conference call of a deal and they go, well, you're just a conduit issuer. What do you care? We're taking the risk. And, that's when I go, oh my God, they haven't got it yet. But why do we do credit underwriting, both from our relationship with Florida Housing and at all? What, as a conduit issuer, why are we even doing this?
Well, there's a couple of reasons, but first, I think kind of start with, the relationship with Florida Housing and them as the administrator of the 4% housing credits. And what may be beneficial here too is to talk a little bit about the history and what I refer to as the deal between the local housing finance authorities and Florida Housing as it relates to the 4% credits. And Mark, if I don't mind, I'd like to throw that back to you to an extent. And I know how instrumental you were in the deal, but just kind of reminding everybody what the deal is and how we got to this spot.
Sure. Well, the deal was that there were people at Florida Housing that wanted to take everything that they require in order to give 4% credits to one of their deals and have it apply to every allocation of 4% credits. And what we said is, wait a minute, we have responsible local HFAs that maybe have their own standards. Maybe we've got different energy standards or different resident programs than you do, or different, amenities and features that we think are important. But we're responsible issuers, and you shouldn't, we don't really want to live by your guidelines, but we do have them. And Florida Housing agreed to that, but a requirement was only if you have a credit underwriting by one of the credit underwriters approved by Florida Housing. So all of our ability as local HFAs to set our own standards on affordability periods, energy efficiency, resident programs, unit and development amenities, all of that comes because Florida Housing allows us to well, we could have our own on top of theirs, but they don't impose theirs because we have the credit underwriting. And there is an expectation, Ben, that we're not going to just be conduit issuers that take the minimum that's required in federal law and that's it. I mean, there is an expectation there that we are going to have our own standards that would be there in place of Florida Housing.
That's the first place that we get involved, because of our relationship with Florida Housing and the 4% credits. But back to why should we be there as a credit underwriter on behalf of the authority? I mean, I am fully aware, and we're all fully aware, that there's many parties to this transaction, but the primarily ones on a bond deal, or we have a lender, we have a syndicator, and we have an issuer. And the lender certainly has a credit underwriting team. They have standards that they have to underwrite to. And the same with the syndicator. They have their underwriting team, and they have standards and shareholders and stakeholders that they have to be accountable to. But the same is with the HFA too. They have responsibility to review the transaction to ensure that it's economically feasible. And that's what we do on your behalf. And what's important to note the differences, I mean, what the lender here is a for-profit lender, and their goal is to make the most profitable loan that they can. And that's a combination of the interest rate and a combination of the fees they may get. That's not necessarily your mission or your goal. And you look at the syndicator, their mission is to maximize the spread between what they buy the credits for what they sell the credits for. That's not your mission. That's not your goal. Your goal as an HFA, your mission as an HFA is pretty much very succinct. We want to provide safe, decent, affordable housing for our constituents, which at a local level just happen to be the citizens that live in our county. That's not on the radar screen of a lender. That's not on the radar screen of a syndicator. So we bring another set of eyes that's focused on your constituents, your missions, and to making sure that we're looking out for you and you alone, so to speak. Do we all do the same sort of financial analysis? Absolutely. But once again, everybody has a different mission. They have different investors, different stakeholders, and we're looking out for you. I think, I'm not going to try to name names here, but there's a beautiful example, which is actually a train wreck example of why you need to have your own underwriter look at these transactions. A transaction down in Southwest Florida that the issue was, and we'll name names here, the Capital Trust Group. They had a transaction, no Florida Housing Credit underwriter involved. I'm not sure how the transaction got closed. I've only seen the train wreck at the end. And so they closed the deal. They started construction. They syndicated credits. Equity was advanced. They came back around afterwards and applied to Florida Housing for credits. And all of a sudden, so we had to start over. We didn't have the mini app deal. And this was not our firm. So I'm getting some of this secondhand, but participated in a lot of those discussions. And come to find out, there was very little underwriting that was done at all. And the primary problem was, some basic underwriting requirements like a capital needs assessment may have been done. However, significant deferred maintenance and structural and systems issues were not addressed in the rehab. And ultimately, there was lots of complaints from the tenants. Those complaints got elevated to HUD. They got in the newspaper. And then all of a sudden it was, well, there's almost $20 million between bond allocation and equity, and we still have this train wreck. I'm not exactly sure if it's even unwound to this day, but that's a really good example of why you need somebody looking over the transaction just to make sure basic credit underwriting procedures are happening and consistent with what you would otherwise expect. But that one's pretty dramatic. But other ones, there's lots of things that go on in these transactions that are perfectly legal. But when I see them, I scratch my head a little bit and go, was that really good public policy? And so one of the things that we do too is we'll point at our deal here is eyes wide open. If there's something unusual in a transaction, we're going to tell you about it. Not whether it's illegal. If it's illegal, we're going to scream and we're not going to go forward. But if it just doesn't quite smell right, it's just not quite consistent with what we typically see, we're going to show it to you. And we're, like I say, eyes wide open. Example of that just recently was a redevelopment in downtown Orlando. Very complex transaction. Obviously, that was very valuable real estate down there that they were trying to maintain for affordable housing. They developed a condo concept where they split the buildings out from a parking garage, and there was a relationship between the limited partnership and the new owner of the condos. And come to find out, the only way you could park, the way they financed that was they had parking fees, and the parking fees were coming from the tenants, and which is perfectly legal. But our question was, well, if somebody doesn't want to pay parking, where do they park? And the answer was, well, they can park on the street. that just didn't seem to be like very good public policy to us. And that was one of the things in our report. And actually, before we filed a report, we brought this to the attention, but eyes wide open. That got in front of the executive director, that got in front of the board, and it was made a determination that's not good public policy. Or what we say, that probably doesn't meet the St. Pete Times test. And ultimately, the transaction got restructured to accommodate that the tenants there had an option for free parking. So those are a couple of the examples that, where we can add some additional benefit to you above and beyond just pure economic feasibility. This topic is, cutting edge issues in what we're seeing right now. And there's a couple of those that I would kind of like to go over. And it goes back to Mark's point of we're seeing a tremendous amount of activity at the local level, primarily in refinancings or acquisition rehabs. And what's really driving those purchases, and we're seeing some really, really big purchase prices. And there's several things that are, in my mind, are kind of coming together at the same time. And the first is a lot of the transactions we're worked on are Section 8 transactions where they're 100% Section 8 or 75 or 80%. And what's driving that is, recently, the fair market value, mark-to-market rental determinations have really skyrocketed. And almost to a point that, I scratch my head if where do these fair market rents come from? Oftentimes they're twice what a traditional tax credit rent are. They're consistent with what I think luxury or high-end market rate apartment rents are.
Ben, real quick, just to make sure that everybody understands, tax credit rents don't limit what developers receive on Section 8 units, right?
That's absolutely right. And that's another public policy action that I scratch my head about too, is that we're going to provide affordable housing for somebody who makes 60% or less the area median. The rents are capped there, but as long as the tenant pays less than 30%, the rents that are paid to the property often and do exceed the maximum tax credit rents. And so there is we are seeing 30 and 40% increases from existing rents to the new rents. And so that in effect is a subsidy at the federal level. They are subsidizing the purchases of these transactions. They're subsidizing the rehabilitation of these transactions, and which is, once again, nothing wrong, but where I scratch my head is how do they come up with these rents? It really doesn't quite make sense to me, but we're seeing it time and time again. The first couple of times I didn't believe it. I did not believe it. I saw the rent comp study. I said, no way. Sure enough, we get through the process a couple of days before closing. We get a brand new Section 8 contract and they match that rent comparability study. Probably the roughly 20 transactions that we've looked at. We've looked at those rent comparability studies. We've underwritten those rents conditioned upon actually seeing the Section 8 contract prior to closing. And with the exception of one, they've all come in at that rent market comparability study. So that's no longer a phenomenon to me, but it's what it translates to me is to a federal subsidy. One of the other new things that we've seen in the last couple of years is what I call a straw GP. The borrower will bring in a general partner, a not-for-profit general partner, primarily for the reason to receive an elderly and a tax abatement related to an elderly property owned by a not-for-profit. Sounds good? Not-for-profit has an elderly property. We are going to abate the taxes there, with the theory being that the not-for-profit will be able to further their mission of providing affordable housing or whatever it may well be. A lot of the not-for-profits that come in have very little, if any, true managerial experience. They don't have the financial capacity. They don't have the experience to act as a real GP. And how the transaction is structured is they all of a sudden, the real GP is now called a Class B limited partner. And the Class B limited partner has control over just about anything that the general partner does. And so that's why I call it a straw general partner. And the real general partner is the Class B. Once again, perfectly legal. Tax abatement, the taxes are reduced. And therefore, that's once again another subsidy to the transaction. And I call that a state subsidy. That's a state law, state statute that creates that. My true concern there, though, is if the light ever really got shined on it, the purpose, at least as I know it, of the statute was to further the mission of the. Well, the compensation that the not-for-profit gets in these transactions is de minimis. De minimis. Sometimes it's $10 per unit per month, maybe $10,000, maybe $15,000. I've seen some that are less than $1,000. And so all the benefit really flows through to the Class B general partner, the Class B limited partner, theoretically, ultimately to the property itself, but then that opens up the door for distributions to the partners and not necessarily furthering the mission of the not-for-profit, and most times not to a benefit of the underlying tenants there. The other,
and wouldn't that be something that an HFA would want to address if it wanted to, as an example of things that Monique talked about that would need to go into guidelines for, change of ownership or structure of ownership?
I absolutely think so. And once again, I'm not so sure what good is really good public policy. And I try to stay out of that, but I have my own personal feelings. A property that has no ad valorem real estate taxes is once again is this. But the local government is still providing services to that transaction. They're still sending fire trucks. They're still sending police there. They're still providing all the traditional services that those tax dollars would otherwise go to fund. And now there's no tax dollars there. And those services are still being provided. So here at the local level, local government is being forced to subsidize these transactions. And I don't mean that to be overly critical, but that in effect, that is what's happening there. And then along those same lines, several years ago, there was a statute change that said if you've been under a regulatory agreement for 15 years, then you're eligible for a 50% tax abatement. And then this year, it went to 100% tax abatement. So that puts us in the same spot that the local government is now subsidizing these transactions on a yearly basis. Whatever ad valorem real estate taxes they otherwise would have gotten, they're no longer getting. However, they still have to pay those same, they have to provide those same services to their constituents, their citizens, just like everybody else. So that's, and that once again, that's another one of these drivers, I believe, of this churn and this turnover at the property level of the sales and the refinancing that we're seeing. Mark talked a little bit about, the other change obviously is the 4% tax credit. It has added a lot of equity to the transaction. When you can do the math, if it was at 3.2, it's now at 4, that's about a 25% increase in equity. One of the things that we have seen though, is that 25% hadn't quite panned all the way out because we have seen decreases in the actual amount of credits paid. I'm not quite sure what's driving that phenomenon, but it's not exact. It's a 25%, and then it comes back down because the price of the credits has decreased over time a little bit. Still a lot more equity coming in, but that's one of the other brand new things that we have recently seen. And here recently.
Go ahead, Ben, sorry.
Most recently, one of the hot topics, so to speak, is coming out of the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions and the increases in construction costs. Started out in lumber, it's spread throughout to drywall and to concrete and as well as labor. And so that's and so that's one of the things that people are grappling with now. I believe that, supply chain will fix itself in over time. How long a time, I do not know. Do some of these transactions absolutely need some assistance? Yes, they do. But I witnessed a conversation at Florida Housing last week that, was beyond, which troubled me, quite frankly. I get the increases in construction costs, and if there's a way for the Florida Housing or the local HFA to help those transactions, all the better. But the transaction in front of them at the time was one that was actually funded in 2019, before the pandemic hit. And so they couldn't get the deal done before the pandemic. They didn't get it done during the pandemic, before prices plummeted. And now all of a sudden, it seems to me that that's just a convenient excuse for somebody that put together a bad application, or not a realistic application, or what we call is somebody pencil whipped application just to get the funding. So I think we're going to see it. So that gives me some concern now. The primary concern that I have is, I'm old enough that we've lived through the financial crisis as well. And there was a different crisis there, where people weren't buying credits, people weren't making loans. And so there was a lot of programs that were developed to overcome that, which created, and was a lot of subsidy programs. And I caution, too much subsidy is a bad thing. And that's really hard for people to understand. But when there's too much subsidy, you take out the economic relationship of having an efficient transaction. I've got all this subsidy. There's very little repayment terms, if any. I'm going to spend every nickel that I'm entitled to. And out of that came very fat budgets. Out of that came fraud, collusion between general contractors, all kinds of bad things. So too much subsidy is a bad thing when you take the natural economic forces out of the transaction. So my antenna is up to that right now too. Hopefully we'll have learned from those lessons. But that is a concern that I have right now, and we're all keeping an eye on it.
Great. Ben, those are things that I think will be great, and reasons that you have a credit underwriter looking at those things. But I want to right now turn to Helen, if I could, and Helen, one of the things that we've seen is, as Monique mentioned, is that there's a lot of new structures. And if you could kind of, walk us through briefly some of those, and more importantly, not just the how they're structured, but what's the implication for issuers out of these new structures? And Lisa, if you could put up the slide from Helen's presentation that shows those, that would be great.
Excellent, thank you. All right.
And this will be available too. This download will be made available to anybody who would, will have it up.
Yes. So I had created a matrix here of the various financing structures that we've been seeing over the last decade and more. But there are so many different financing structures, as Monique was noting, at this point in time, because so many different providers have come online, and there have been kind of innovations or new ideas, new ways to finance the tax credit transactions. And from time to time, HFAs may also see 501c3 transactions, so these could apply to those as well. But this might help an HFA shape their policies and applications, just so you can be aware of the terms of tax exempt bonds these days. And I noticed, Ben noted how the full effect of the 4% credit has not been realized in all cases, because the price of credits has dropped a little bit. In part, that may be because just the demand for credits, there's so many more credits, and maybe the same number of institutions that are buying those credits, and there are other reasons as well. But one trend that I've seen in financings is that the equity folks in various instances, and maybe many instances, are driving the tax exempt bond structure. There's been a lot of consolidation of, certain groups that are offering tax credit syndication.
Sorry, Helen, just real quickly, if everyone could just check that they're muted, because there's a paper moving across a microphone on somebody's that's interfering with Helen and our ability to hear her. So if everyone who's out there, just make sure you are muted, please. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, there's a lot of providers these days that offer, debt and equity, and they like to, to offer the entire package. A lot of the institutions that are buying equity want to have a debt roll. For example, financial institutions, they may be buying the credits, but they might want to provide the construction loan. They might want that construction loan to be tax exempt, or they might want it to be taxable. Or they may want to provide a GSE loan, meaning a Fannie Mae or FHA or Freddie Mac loan. And, so they might want to work all that into the equation. So because the equity pricing is so significant on deals, developers, are often, choosing the equity provider and maybe just going with whatever debt, they are offering. So in the chart here, we have, different headings or different considerations, who the lender is. There's a construction phase and a permanent phase to multifamily financings. Although on certain acquisition rehab transactions, they may be able to underwrite the current net operating income, and the financing might not have a distinct construction phase and permanent phase. It may be kind of all in one. Another item on the chart is the term that the tax exempt bonds are outstanding. And this is shown, just to illustrate, if you have an issuer fee, you need to kind of apply your issuer fee methodology on the term that the bonds would be outstanding to see, what your income will be. And also on issuer fee, the tax code impacts issuer fee. For example, you'll see certain structures are outstanding only 2 or 3 years. And you might say, well, I guess I want the same fee income as if, that I would have gotten if the bonds were outstanding for 15 years. Well, federal tax law limits the income to 1.5% per annum on your yield. So, there are forces. It's something that you would want to work with your bond counsel on to make sure that your policies are compliant with tax and IRS guidelines. And then there are just, kind of notes on the side, but just running through the structures. There's your traditional bank placement, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Freddie Mac also has a tax exempt loan structure. And the documents to these are somewhat similar, although they do vary significantly by institution. Monique can tell you that JP Morgan Chase's documents are far different than Freddie Mac's documents. And for example, Freddie Mac is really only a permanent lender, and you would have a bank paired with them. But that's for both construction and permanent, the tax exempt bonds would be outstanding the full 17 to 18 years. I have separately shown FHA 221D4 and 223F. And the FHA loans are the highest leverage loans generally. And the other thing about the permanent loans on the FHA side is they're a full 35 or 40 years, depending on if you're doing a 223F or a 221D4. So for a developer, that is a very attractive financing because they have their financing in place, twice as long as the typical tax credit bond transaction. And with today's low rates, you saw, FHA loans between 2 and 3%. So to have 35 or 40-year funding at those levels is very attractive. Of course, it takes a year or more to get through that process. And the tax exempt bond side of these, because the FHA rates are lower than if we structured them backing tax exempt bonds that are 35 or 40 years, that we call it a cash collateralized tax exempt bond. And really the bonds are just being issued for the purpose of qualifying for the 4% tax credit. And they're backed by US Treasuries, and they remain in place until the units are placed in service. In other words, the bonds only need to stay outstanding until completion of construction or completion of rehab. And so this has become a very popular structure because it's so cost effective, and this is the most popular short-term tax exempt bond structure. The third item is really the same as the previous, where you just issue short-term cash collateral bonds that are outstanding 2 to 3 years, but the permanent financing is just any taxable form of financing. It might be Fannie Mae or rural development or just a taxable bank loan. That structure of the short-term bonds can be paired with any taxable financing. The fourth item is just a short-term tax exempt construction loan backed by a mortgage, but the borrower chooses a permanent taxable execution. So again, it can be any kind of a bank or any form of taxable permanent financing.
So
But-
Helen, the point of all those is that you're only going to get a fee for, a little bit of time. So you got to figure out how can you recoup it. That's a policy issue. And how do you make all your restrictions that you want on a development be alive after the bonds are retired, which, it's not the end of, we don't want our deals to where we have, resident programs or other things that just go away after 2 to 3 years. I mean, or never are implemented because the bonds aren't there. And that's something you need to work with bond counsel on.
That's right, Mark. And what we've been trying to do on those short-term deals is build a lot of that transfer restrictions on ownership of the borrower, transfer restrictions on the project into the land use restriction agreement, rather than cross-referencing mortgages and loan agreements that aren't going to be outstanding once the bonds are paid off.
Very important points. Thank you. So another form that we're seeing frequently is a tax exempt lender. They're often part of an equity group as well. R4, Redstone are examples of the names of these lenders. They're really sort of like a Fannie Mae lender, if you will. Like they are not actually buying the bonds. They're doing credit underwriting, and they identify an investor to buy the bonds. And sometimes these are via a private placement where the end purchaser, typically a financial institution, directly purchases the bonds. But sometimes the end investor wants the bonds for accounting purposes to be treated as a bond security rather than a loan. And they want an underwriter, broker dealer, like an RBC Capital Markets, to stand in between and actually purchase the bonds and redeliver the bonds to that financial institution. And, often the term sheets, you wouldn't know that end financial institution was buying because they're on R4 letterhead or Redstone letterhead. So it just, sometimes there's policy implications there. So just highlighting that, but those are typically 17 to 18 years, and they're really very much like a bank private placement. The next one, bond underwriter, for example, RBC Capital Markets, there are several types of bond structures. RBC could market directly to a financial institution or mutual funds or an insurance company and directly market non-rated bonds, where we would serve as underwriter and we would purchase the bonds and resell them to another investor. Or another publicly offered execution is Fannie Mae has a product called the Fannie Mae MTEB, MBS tax exempt bonds. So those would be AAA rated bonds, and we would offer those publicly. But for the, for the issuer policies on this, if it's a non-rated execution, as Monique was discussing, what type of investor letter or minimum denominations would you want? That applies to really all of the placement structures. And the last one is a unique one that we don't often think about, but sometimes borrowers want the ability to structure a seller note on a tax exempt basis. And we've seen this in several occasions. That tax exempt seller note might be 40 years, like it may be very long, but they may find that that's a cost-effective way for them to meet what we call the 50% test, where it qualifies the transaction for 4% tax credits. And sometimes the tax exempt seller notes might be structured with a fairly high rate of interest. And that can raise issues because there's a state law that says any bonds may not exceed an interest rate of over 3% over the 20 bond buyer index. So it's just like one more box to check when you're closing a transaction to run yields to make sure you're in compliance with both, federal and state law purposes. But it's just another, item to consider for policies. And I'm sure everyone will consult their bond counsel and financial advisor for those items.
Right. Helen, I want to see if there's anybody has any questions, please type them. And also I echo that because Helen's the best banker that I know, and bankers love the details of the banking. And sometimes I know that if you're a board member of an HFA, all of what Helen just said, if you're a staff person or a financial advisor, it's making sense. And as a board member, you're going, oh my God, am I supposed to really understand the difference between Redstone and R4 and what's it? Somebody has got to take all those structures and translate them into policy decisions that you as a board have to make. And Helen, thank you very much for laying those out, because it's a great laundry list of people, and it's a starting point for people to take every one of those. And then at each HFA say, well, what are the policy implications for these? And we need to make them. So I want to, again, does anybody have any questions, or have we, left everybody there? If you could type them in the chat. I don't see any right now. Am I missing anything? Nope. Well, that's, sorry. Anybody want to raise your hand and ask one so you could actually speak if you'd like? If not, I want to, wrap this session then with the big picture again, which is, if you're on the board of an HFA, you're not a bank. You're a public entity, and the responsibility is to the public, and in particular, the citizens of the county. And that doesn't mean that you do stupid things financially, but your job is public policy. And your role in this, and our role as HFAs, is to have the best public policy that we can, while people that are going to make lots and lots of money, including all of us on the panel to some degree. We all, are professionals that live in this business, but the developers also, that you are getting the best public policy that you possibly can, and the best result for the citizens of your county in this very complex system. And that's the overriding goal for an HFA. And the other is, again, as Ben said, you've got a responsibility to make sure that, to look beyond just, is it technically legal, to, is this really good policy, and what's this going to do to affordable housing if this was the headline in the Miami Herald or the Tampa Bay Times or the Jacksonville, Florida Times Union. How's this going to look? And I would just one thing, Ben, you had an example. One of the things people say is, why do you guys want a construction guarantee? What's it to you? I mean, we got all these other people that are getting guarantees, and Ben, you'll remember that we had one in Tampa on a deal where the guarantor had to write a check for $20 million to get a project built. And having that guarantee was essential. Having a payment performance bond would have been useless, because the developer and the bonding company are still in court 5 years later. So the whole idea of guarantees is really important as well. So there are things that you can look out for in making sure that a development gets built, that others may have an interest, but not the one you'd have if it's written up in the front page of the paper that you financed the deal, but you didn't have any rights to ensure that it got built. So I want to thank our panelists. We're going to be following up in a few weeks with multifamily part 2, with other aspects of this, particularly things like, when you have a monitor, what do they monitor? And other things related to Florida housing. And if you could just pop the platinum sponsors up really quickly. Lisa, if you could go there. Broward, Dominion, Hillsborough, Jacksonville, Miami-Dade, RBC, eHousing, Raymond James, Pinellas, Escambia, and Lee. Those are our platinum sponsors. You will see the gold and the silvers and the breakfast coming up, but we really want to thank our sponsors. Our next session will be this Friday at noon, the federal session. If you have any questions that you think of after the session you'd like answered, if you send them to Lisa or myself, we'll get them to a panelist and we'll get them answered for you. So thanks everybody for joining. This is our kickoff over the next month, and I really think you will find Friday's session, where Sherry Gully from HFA Miami will be moderating the federal panel, will be really interesting, because there's lots of action going on there. So everyone, have a great afternoon, and thank you for joining. Thanks, panelists.